Hey everyone, and welcome to our March live event with Nicki LaFoyle. She's back here to answer all of your sewing questions. So thank you for being here, Nicki.
So glad to be here.
Of course. All right. So we have a couple things that we want to promote to tell you that we have going on, and that is one of our downloads right now, and it is for gifts, easy projects that are for gift giving. So if you're thinking of maybe Mother's Day coming up, or you have someone's birthday year coming up, these are great projects. You can click the link and download those free projects there. Nicki, what is your go-to free, easy gift sewing project?
Something quick and easy to sew up for someone is um, like little bags, especially if you're giving them like a little gift. If you sew up a bag to put the gift in, it's like it just makes that little gift that much extra special. And you can go with just something small as a gift, and then jazz it up. And then the bag is reusable too.
Yep, perfect. I love it. Bags, tags, all things that make your gift even that much more personal. That's perfect. Awesome. So again, check out that link and download those projects if you want to try those out. We have a couple questions coming in here right now. So if this is your first time joining us for a live event, Nicki's going to answer all of your sewing questions, and you can ask those questions by just typing them into the chat box, and then I will ask them to her, and she will answer them. So our first one coming in here, this is from Robin. She wants to know if you can please explain why you can sew a seam on a 4-thread overlocker with knits, but only finish seams on woven fabrics. Why can't you also make seams on your overlocker for wovens?
You can. You can definitely sew anything you want with your serger, whether it's knit or woven. And I know people a lot of times just they'll say that they love to sew knits, especially on their serger, because that seam then will have stretch, and it's just quick and easy. You buzz it along, and it cuts off the excess for you, and it is just super quick and easy. But yeah, you can definitely take advantage of the seam finishing aspect of a serger without necessarily needing that extra stretch built into the seam. So you can absolutely stitch your wovens on a serger as well. Just apply the same rules, making sure that you're stitching at your seam allowance, and whatever seam allowance is on your pattern, you're not or you're cutting off the right amount, with your blade to make sure you're getting your seam allowance correct. But yeah, you definitely can.
Yep. So I know we've talked about this before, that neither of us really use a serger all that often, but you did mention seam allowance. And I think that is something that people have questions about a lot with the serger, because it's a little bit harder to maybe know how much you're cutting off. So would you change up seam allowances, adjust them? Say you're using a commercial pattern with that 5/8 inch seam allowance. How would you do seam allowances on your serger?
So you can adjust the blade on your serger to some extent. You can disengage it totally, or you can move the width of it. So I would say just make sure that you are. So there's a couple of things you can do. You can either measure what your seam allowance is going to be on your serger, where your blade is right now, and make sure that that is your seam allowance on your pattern. So if your blade is set to set to a 1/2 inch, so that would be your seam allowance. You can make sure that that is the seam allowance you're using on your garment pieces, or pieces of whatever you're sewing. Or you can adjust your blade to be the seam allowance that you're using. And I think you can consult your serger manual to figure out how to do that. Like Ashley said, I have not ever tried doing that on my own serger. I have threaded it, and I have used it a couple of times in the last 5 years, but I'm by no means a serger expert. But yeah, there are definitely ways to figure out, to make sure you've got the right seam allowance on your serger, because that definitely plays in, using the blade to cut off the excess, to make sure your seam allowance is correct.
Yeah, absolutely. You and I are just going to have to sit down and make ourselves use our sergers at some point.
At some point, I'm going to have to.
All right, we'll put that on the to-do list. All right, our next one here, Jackie wants to know, when using a decorative stitch for applique that requires several stops and starts for a thread color change, what is the best way to lock the thread ends without changing the look of the stitch?
That's a good question, and I've never tried doing that before, but my immediate thought is, um, don't use the back stitch button because, when you're using a decorative stitch, that can kind of mess up where you are in the stitch. And also it can create, lumps that you don't want when you're trying to stitch out something nice and delicate. So I would say you can change your threads and then either right then or at the end, once you've already done all of your thread changes, pull those threads to the back. So you can, flip it over and kind of tug on your bobbin thread, and that'll pull the needle thread to the back. And you can just manually, tie 2 or 3 knots and then trim off the excess. So that's usually how I will tie off my threads if I don't want to use the back stitch button for, either of those reasons that I mentioned.
Yep, absolutely. I like to do the same thing. And then at the beginning, I always will try to engage, if the machine has it, the automatic stitch in place, not necessarily a back stitch function, but some machines do the stitch in place. So
Right.
then you can't even really see it. It doesn't mess up the stitch at all.
Nice.
Yeah. All right. Brenda wants to know, how do you iron velvet?
That's a good question. You don't iron velvet because it will crush the nap. So the nap of velvet, as you know, if you've ever touched velvet, it's soft, and because the threads have that nap, which is just like the little hairs sticking up to give it that fuzzy texture. So you can imagine if you put pressure and heat down on it, even if you're doing it from the back, it can crush that against your ironing board. So there is a tool. I don't remember what it's called, but it's like a board with little needles sticking up. Not needles because that would like go through, but it's kind of like blunt needles. So you can put that velvet down on that, and that kind of allows the nap to nestle in between those needle-ish things that are sticking up, and then you can either gently press or steam from the wrong side, so that prevents crushing of the nap. I don't want to have an extra tool in my sewing room for the rare occasion that I want to press velvet. So what I do is just use steam. So you can steam gently from the wrong side and then finger press, making sure you don't press too hard to avoid crushing that nap. And if you do end up crushing the nap a little bit, like if you see on the right side, the nap is sort of squished down, or if it gets kind of shiny, what you can do is hit it with a little bit of steam. Just, hold the iron kind of a couple of inches away from the fabric, and either use your finger or you can use a little toothbrush to kind of fluff that nap back up. But it is important not to use like your normal pressing methods with velvet. There are some velvets like crushed velvet, which has a crushed texture already. And in that case, it's probably fine to give it a little press because you're not going to notice the crushed nap amidst the, intentional crushing of the nap. But a lot of times in those velvets that the nap is nice and, continuous, you don't want to have that crushed. So you can use a combination of steaming and gentle finger pressing to press your seams open in those cases.
Okay, so I guess the follow-up to that would be, I won't say like why press velvet, but like velvet doesn't necessarily wrinkle that much, right? So if you're doing it for a seam finishing reason, is there a different way to sort of approach how to finish off that seam instead of pressing?
I think because velvet does not really wrinkle, you're not going to need to press the whole thing. It would be for pressing open seams. And I think the best bet for velvet, it's different because velvet can be made of a lot of different fiber contents too, and that also kind of plays into how it's going to behave. But for velvets that like a velveteen, which is like a nice stable cotton velvet. Um, Even just finger pressing right along the seam line is going to give you enough of crispness to your seam that you might not even need to bring the iron and the heat into play. So you can kind of test with your velvet to see how much pressure it'll take without crushing the nap as well.
Perfect. All right. V wants to know, what is the easiest way to make gathered seams evenly distributed?
So let's see, gathering seams. There are a couple different methods, and I'll talk about them, and you can kind of decide what is the best way for you. Because I always just run usually 2 lines of basting stitches along whatever length I'm trying to gather. So I do one just inside what my seam allowance is going to be, and then one like a 1/4 inch away from that. So, and the idea of having 2 lines is if one breaks, then you've got the second one, and it helps to make the gathers not so like big and bulky in places. It kind of helps make the gathers gentler and more delicate. But that does take a lot of gentle pulling on both of those strings and distributing. So some people like to lay a line of dental floss or even embroidery floss, but dental floss, when it's waxed especially, makes it really easy to gather along. So lay your dental floss just inside your seam allowance and zigzag stitch over it. And that kind of makes a little tunnel for the dental floss for you to be able to pull your gathers, however gathered you want your ruffle to be. You can also use a gathering foot, or a ruffling foot, it might be called.
I think it's called a ruffler foot, but that was going to be, I have a follow-up about what's the difference between a ruffle and a folded pleat, but that's like a whole nother can of worms about getting that in there.
Oh, yeah, so there are feet, and there are feet that that just do tucks, which is more pleats.
Yeah.
So it depends on the look that you're going for, but there are different ways to do it, and it kind of just depends on your preferred method, and it depends on the intended use of your ruffle as well. But for me, I've been fond of the 2 basting stitch lines. But I know for people who might have arthritis, and it's harder to pull on those gathered on the basting strings for gathers, the zigzag stitching over the dental floss is kind of easier on the hands, and doesn't quite take as much pulling on your hands. So that could be an option.
Yeah, absolutely. And then of course, if you are someone who likes the look of, gathers in, but wants it to be, perfectly pleated or ruffled like it would be with a foot, they do make, and I don't know if you have used it before. I first saw it with Pam Demore uses it, and it's like a length of tape, and it's got all of these numbers on there, and you can pick the number, and you can fold perfect pleats or ruffle or whatever you want to call it, evenly space it out. So they have things like that too, that you can be very precise in your ruffles.
Yeah.
All right. Grace wants to know, I am a complete beginner. How should I start sewing?
Well, I think just kind of starting out slow is a good approach. I'm glad that you're starting to join the community. This is a great time to start sewing. Anytime is a great time to start sewing, but home sewing has seen such a resurgence in the last 10, 15 years that there are a lot of resources out there. And especially now in the internet age, there are resources in people's blogs and videos. But for a beginner sewer, I think video learning is super helpful because you can see the action in progress rather than just seeing photos of the process along the line, which can sometimes get confusing. So, of course, National Sewing Circle has tons of great videos, great little tips and trick videos to get you started, little projects. But I would say, start by choosing fairly straightforward, simple project. So like I said at the beginning, like a little bag is a great project because it's straight lines and straight seams. Pillowcases are great because, again, straight lines, you're cutting rectangles and straight seams, and it can be done on a cotton fabric. So when you go into Joann's or whatever fabric store you go to, the bulk of the fabric is probably going to be quilting cottons, which are just the stable, fairly tightly woven. A lot of times they come in a million different cute prints and colors, stripes, patterns. So that makes it really fun to choose from. And that's an important thing too for your first couple of projects, is to just choose a fabric that calls to you and that you love, because you're going to get excited about it and it's going to make you want to sew more. So definitely don't skimp, I would say, on the fabric. Just follow your heart, and at least for your first couple of projects, you want to get excited about it and love it. So buy the fabric that calls to you. Like I said, quilting cottons are great to work with because they're stable. They're not going to slide around on you. They're easy to sew, easy to mark on if you need to draw lines on the wrong side for cutting. Whereas, slippery fabrics and knit fabrics are a little bit more tricky to work with. So I'd say stay away from those until you have gotten really comfortable using your sewing machine and doing the basics of sewing. So yeah, just start with some small projects and noodle around on nationalsewingcircle.com to get some inspiration for building your skills up, little by little, step by step. Don't try to jump in and make a pair of pants with a zipper right away, because you're going to get frustrated and want to quit. So start slow to build your skills and have fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you've been someone that has been watching Nicki do these live events it's been a long time now, you may have heard of her pants story, which was one of your first sewing projects, was a pair of pants that you then couldn't wear. So you know from experience that pants aren't a good project to start with. But speaking of nice, easy projects, things that are made from cotton, again, we have the download 7 easy sewing projects perfect for gift giving. Lots of those are very easy, good beginner projects as well. So you can either gift it to yourself or to someone else when you're done. All right, Gail wants to know if you have any tips for using your button foot. I've never done this before, but want to try it on my next project.
Yeah, so the button foot, so I'm assuming Gail means the buttonhole foot.
Or the button foot, because there is that little button foot too. So
there is. That. There's a button foot that kind of looks like a little claw, a lot of times anyway, that just holds the button down. And so some machines have a button stitch, which just looks like the 2 holes of the button. So you can select that, and that automatically disengages the feed dogs, so your fabric doesn't try to, sew forward. And it will do as many stitches as it tells you need for a button, just going back and forth to the different button holes, and then it'll take a couple stitches in place to lock it, and then you're done. If you don't have a button stitch, you can put your button foot on and clamp it down on your button and use the hand wheel to make sure your zigzag stitch is in the right place. So to make sure your zigzag stitch is wide enough to get to each hole of the button, and disengage your feed dogs manually if you need to. But definitely use the hand wheel to turn very slowly. Don't just press the pedal and go, because you might break a needle or a button if your zigzag stitch is too wide for the holes and it goes to hit on the button. I've taken chunks out of plastic buttons before because I was just a little bit too wide, and it can be scary. That needle hits the button and the machine will, at least mine, will make like this beeping noise, and it'll make this like grinding noise, and it's kind of scary. The piece of a button will go flying. So be careful. So yeah, that button foot is fairly straightforward to use. It can save you a ton of time to not hand sew buttons on. But the buttonhole foot, just in case anyone was wondering about that, I have, this is what mine looks like. And I think I did a video on a buttonhole foot, and I don't know if is that up on the site yet, Ashley?
I don't think it's up yet, but yeah, it should be coming soon.
Okay, so video should be coming soon, which will explain a lot better than I'm about to right now because I show you actually how to use it. But this buttonhole foot, some may look a little bit different, but it's the same basic idea. So your foot clips in here, and this goes toward the back. And it kind of measures your buttonhole for you by you putting your button in this little thingy bob at the back, because it will clamp down on it. And the distance here, you can see how that moves when I move the thing that holds the button. So it changes the size of the buttonhole depending on the diameter of your button. So this distance essentially is going to be your buttonhole length. So if you have a buttonhole stitch on your machine, select that, and your machine will have a little flag, a little phalange at the back by the presser foot that pulls down and sits right here. And the buttonhole foot, you just select your buttonhole, stitch, and when it starts stitching, that little flag that sits here, the foot will move, and then it'll hit this little gauge here, which tells the machine that is as long as the buttonhole needs to be, and then it'll push it back up to stitch the other leg of the buttonhole. So it does all of the measuring for you. So it's super nifty. A lot of times I find that this makes my buttonholes a little bit too long. So sometimes I will kind of measure my button myself and measure it against this, and I will just I'll take my button out and I will make this a little bit smaller and just make sure I measure this distance to make sure my button is going to be able to go through that. So if you're sewing like a wool coat, I would say that a slightly longer buttonhole is good because you want that button to be able to go through your buttonhole with, the layers of the thickness of the wool coat or whatever thick material you're using. But if you're just using like a thinner quilting cotton, your buttonhole doesn't need to be that much longer than your button for it to be able to slide through with the thickness of the fabric, because it won't be that much extra thick. So it doesn't need to be as much extra long as this buttonhole foot makes it. But yeah, this is a great tool. It's great to know how to use. I stitched a sample when I was first using this to mark where my buttonholes, like the direction that they go, where they start, what leg they do first. So you make sure you are aligning this over your buttonhole marking on your fabric correctly and know which way it's going to go. So I recommend that, stitching a sample first. But yeah, they're great tools to know how to use.
Yep, perfect. Awesome. All right, our next one here, Carly says that she's making a swimsuit for her daughter. She's seen the nude lining fabric, but is wanting to know if she could simply double up the swim fabric instead of using that lining. And then do you have any other tips for swimsuit making?
Kudos to you, Carly, for making a swimsuit. That's like a pretty advanced project. I have never made a swimsuit, although I have thought about it several times because buying swimsuits is just difficult. So good on you. As far as doubling up the fabric instead of using a nude lining, I would say it's probably fine because most swimsuit fabric is, thin and flexible anyway. I think the only reason that companies might use a nude lining for like ready-made swimsuits is because it's cheaper. It might be somewhat thinner, but like I said, if your swim fabric is, if doubled up, it still feels fine on the body. I would say there's no harm in doing it that way. And again, I've never made a swimsuit, so that's just my thinking about fabric choices. So it's just my opinion. And then in terms of tips for swimsuit making, all I would say is Make sure you're using a spandex needle or a stretch needle, which is designed for super elastic material. Not only knit, but knits that have elastic built into the fiber, which swimsuits will have. And make sure you're using a thread that is durable, able to be washed because it's going to be in the water a lot, able to withstand that. So I think an all-purpose thread would probably be fine, but if you're making a swimsuit, I'm assuming that you will know kind of where you're at with that, and have done a little bit of research on that. So that's just my initial thought on it. But yeah, make sure you've got the right needle and that you're building a lot of stretch into the seams, because those swimsuits will need to definitely stretch around the body and kind of snap back and hold tight to the body. So make sure that the stretch and snap back is maintained in those seams.
Yep. Well, there you go, Nicki. There is your serger project. You should make a swimsuit using your serger. There you go.
Yep.
All right. Brenda says she wants to thank you for the velvet tips. She has some silk velvet for the underlining of a long coat, which sounds gorgeous.
That sounds amazing.
All right. Christine says, I would like to make something in craft felt that has curls, kind of like curly ribbon. Is there a product I could use on felt that would hold this shape?
So to make felt curl and to make it stay curled, it's a good question. I wonder if like a spray starch kind of, if you could curl that felt around a pencil or something and spray it with spray starch, if that would be enough to then like let it dry, if that would be enough to hold it. I don't know if there's a specific product that would do that. I'm trying to think of products that would, like a spray glue or something that would make it hold. Because I did, a million years ago, I made a lace crown for my daughter, and it was a spray glue that I used. I set it in the shape that I wanted it, like a circular shape, and I spritzed spray glue on it, and I had to do like 5 layers and let it dry and spray it again to give the stiffness that I wanted. But it held. But that was lace, so felt is going to be a little bit thicker than that. So that's where I would start, probably, is with a spray product. Ashley, do you have any?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. Almost like a what you would, I don't want to say like a spray basting kind of thing, because that sort of just like goes away, right? Yeah. So it can't be any sort of temporary adhesive. But I was wondering if you'd have to like apply like heat to it or something almost. Like I'm picturing like a little miniature like curling iron or something to use. But then it's like the only thing when I think of like that curly ribbon, it kind of stays soft. I don't know if that's a word to use. So anything, if you're going to do that spray glue or something on there, your felt is going to become essentially crispy. Like it's not going to stay. So I think you're going to have to weigh, like, do you want the curls to stay and it be like this?
Be static, be right. Yeah. So, and in that vein too, if any kind of spray thing doesn't make it hold its shape, you could even stitch 2 layers together and put a wire in it to make kind of like a wired ribbon. And again, that would be static too. It wouldn't have any of the bounce of curly ribbon, but that would be a pretty good way to make sure it would curl and stay curled. So,
Yep. And if something were to happen, to be able to easily recurl it too with the wire, that would be good. If you're still watching, I would love to know what it is you're making though with the curly felt ribbon. I think it sounds awesome. I'd love to know.
Yeah, very great.
All right, next one here. Lisa asks, if we clean our machines regularly and our sewing machines are working properly, how often do we need to take our machines in for servicing? I was once told by a machine specialist, never, but can we just wait until we have a problem with our machine?
Yeah, so I'm glad that the machine specialist said never, because sometimes machine specialists will say, yeah, bring it in once a year to get business.
Yeah.
But I'm of that opinion too. you maintain it regularly yourself, doing the things that you need. Most modern machines don't need to be oiled by you. Some older machines might, and your manual will tell you that. But all the maintenance that I need to do to my machine is dusting it and making sure it's lint free every so often. And yeah, making sure I'm not like knocking it around or anything. Just if you treat it nicely, you shouldn't have any need to take it in. There are cases where if you accidentally like sew a button, or if you hit a metal zipper with your needle and it throws your timing off, you will know if the timing is thrown off because it will be impossible to create a good stitch. In those cases, taking it to a specialist would be necessary, because that requires getting down into the mechanisms way inside the machine that that home sews generally are not qualified to do. And you want to take care of your machine and not screw it up more than you already did if you stitched onto a metal zipper. So I would entrust that to a specialist. There was one time though that I don't know what I did. I pulled the thread up from the bobbin too much or too hard or something, and it like pulled the bobbin plate up. So like even underneath my throat plate, there was a little black piece that kind of snapped into place, and something I did dislodged it, and it shifted, and my needle then was hitting it, so it couldn't go through. And I was like, oh, what's happening? And I was in the studio at the time trying to film a video, which made it so much more stressful. But I just did a quick Google search, actually, because I didn't have my manual with me, and figured out how to slide that plate back in place and kind of click it back in place, and I was able to figure it out. So if something wild is happening, you can take a look at it and Google it to see if other people have had the same problem, and have put a solution out there in forums or whatever. But if after a little bit of research and digging, it's you're still baffled, then you take it to a specialist. But yeah, unless you have a specific problem, I don't think it needs to go in for preventative maintenance at all. As long as, like Lisa said, if you keep it clean regularly, make sure it's not building up all kinds of lint and dust. That's all you really need to do to maintain the machine.
Absolutely. Well, I hope we continued filming while you were doing this, and it was like a diagnostic and repair video all at once. That would have been perfect.
Yeah, they might have a blooper of me going like like this.
Well, that's good. It happens to everybody. I would say we've talked about this. I've had a number of machines, and I also have never taken one in for preventative maintenance, but I have, on an older machine, thrown the timing off considerably to where the entire bobbin case shifted almost 180 degrees, and so your needle can't even go down because like there's an opening on one side and then not. And it wasn't even, I didn't even hit anything metal, but I was trying to sew through like 3 layers of corduroy or something ridiculous that like it was just hard. So you'll definitely know like when it's I need to call a machine doctor situation.
Yeah.
So. All right. Anna adds to our conversation earlier about gathers that you can also use elastic thread in the bobbin, and then you just need to adjust the top thread tension for the amount of gathers you want. So I know we've talked about this before, sort of shearing with elastic thread, but in case someone doesn't know what she's referring to, do you want to tell us a little bit about what she's talking about?
Yes, and that's a really good point, Anna. Thank you for putting that out there. So using elastic thread in the bobbin is a good way to get gathers as well, but they call it shearing because you need to stitch several lines of it in order to get the best effect for gathering. So they sell pre-sheared fabric. You may have seen at the fabric store as well. They use it for having the gathers up at the bodice, and then the lower is not gathered, so it kind of flows down into a skirt. So you wind the elastic thread on the bobbin, and then you use regular thread in the needle. Some machines want you to wind the elastic thread on the bobbin by the machine. Most will say to wind it by hand, but that's something you may have to check into if you want to do some shearing. You want to wind the elastic thread on the bobbin with a little bit of tension, not super tight, but not so loose that it's just all falling off. So add a little bit of tension to that. And you want to increase your stitch length. So your needle is, I increase mine all the way. So it's taking more fabric in each bite of the needle, so it will gather it to the maximum effect. And yeah, it takes 3 or 4 or 5 lines of stitching for that elastic thread to have enough pull to create really nice gathers. So if you stitch one line, you might not get a lot of gathers, but in subsequent lines, it will start gathering it up more. And it works best on lightweight fabric. So the stretch of elastic thread is not so strong that it would gather up a heavy, like bottom weight fabric, like a corduroy or denim or something like that. Quilting cotton, it will. I've done shearing on a super lightweight jersey knit, and it worked really well. It created a lot of really pretty gathers. And 1 layer of fabric is always better than 2, because the lighter weight, less stiff, the nicer it's going to gather. So yeah, increase your stitch length, and you're stitching just a straight stitch. And if you are not satisfied with the amount of gathers, you can either stitch more lines, or you can hit it with a little bit of steam. And sometimes that steam will help that elastic thread to kind of shrink up a little bit more and gather up a little bit more. So yeah, if that kind of a wide band of stitching is conducive to your project, you can use that to make your gathers as well. It's great for like a gathered waistband, like for the bodice, or like a waistband for a gathered waistband for a skirt. It can be really cute, and just a fun way to create gathers. And if you've never tried it, I think you should, because it's fun and it just kind of increases your repertoire of things that you can do and fun details you can add to projects.
Yeah, absolutely. And it gives you the reason to sort of play around with your needle tension, which I know a lot of people never want to touch that and then think they never should touch it or anything like that, or are afraid to do that. So this is sort of a technique that makes you go out of your comfort zone with several things. So yeah, definitely a fun one to try. All right. Brenda says she has inherited a large amount of horsehair canvas from a relative who did tailoring and passed. Any ideas of what to do with it?
So horsehair canvas, so that's used a lot of times in tailoring of like blazers and jackets and things like that. It's used as like an interlining, not over the whole garment, generally just in like across the shoulders and in top areas to give it a little bit of stability and stiffness. So that's the only use that I have ever seen it done with. So if you have never made a blazer and you want to try, that would be a great way to add just that extra detail into your blazer, because you can make a blazer without interlining, but it makes it crisp and just beautiful. It's not, I don't want to say it's a couture detail, because it's not really. They use it a lot of times in men's suits and tailored jackets and stuff like that, but it is a little bit of an extra step for the home sewer. But it can take your blazer from just like a regular, almost could be frumpy, into this, slick looking, just top notch. So you can give that a try. You can also just Google ways to use horsehair canvas and see if it can be used as interlining in something else, like something else that needs stability, whether it's like if you're stitching boxes to organize your sewing room, I don't think horsehair canvas really gives a ton of stability and stiffness like a fusible interfacing would. But if you have a ton of it and you're looking for ways to use it, you can maybe get creative with other things that need that little bit of stability.
Absolutely. All right. I'm really, really glad that she chimed in with this. Christine is using the curly felt for an orange curly leprechaun beard. So I think that's going to be awesome. And I think so back to the, okay, now that we know it's going to be, I guess, okay, I don't know if you are making the leprechaun beard to then wear it or if it's like on a leprechaun doll. I don't know. My mind went two different ways. But like if you're going to wear it, maybe not do the wire and stuff just because it's like right by your face. But that's awesome. And I think we really need to see the finished projects too when it's done.
That sounds super cute.
Yes. All right. So Trishan asks about Y seams. What method do you use for joining Y seams, specifically with something like a hexagon? I'm wanting to know if it's easier when you leave 1/4 inch open from edges when you're joining them together.
So this seems like I have never tried to join hexagons. Like,
because we haven't gotten you into quilting enough yet. We're working on it. But
another thing I need to put on my list. I keep saying I'm going to do it. But yeah, Ashley, you're more of a quilter than I am. So in piecing things together, I don't typically piece things together to make a whole. I use, fabric for garments. So in piecing hexagons, is that the direction this question is going?
Yeah, I mean, and that's absolutely the way I would do it with stopping 1/4 inch from the edge. So, like a Y seam, it comes together, it looks exactly like a Y, right? So you have these 3 pieces that are coming together. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, if you just sew like the top 2 or the first 2 together and you stop 1/4 inch from the edge, then when you sew on the next piece, then you're able to fold that little 1/4 inch back because you're sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And that allows you to come together. And then all of your seams in the center there, all 3 of them are coming together, are going to end right at that same spot. So it's like if you try to stitch all the way to the edge, then there's nowhere to attach that next one. So
right.
Yeah, definitely just stopping. And you can do this technique, I've done the same thing when, think about like making the corner of a box, like that you're just talking about the little boxes. So same thing. So doesn't matter what seam allowance you're using, you would stop that distance away. And make sure you do, I know this is not commonly done with quilting, a back stitch, but I like to because otherwise when I'm folding it up and out of the way, I tend to, pull that last stitch and you have to go back and redo it anyway. So I would always just do a little, just one, just to hold it.
But, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And I've done that before, just not in that context, but making, I made a backpack and I had to stitch. I was stitching a piece onto a piece that had already been sewn at the bottom. And I did. You leave that last little bit of that seam allowance undone so that you can stitch the next piece on. So
that makes sense. So really you're doing more quilting and you just didn't even know it. So we're sneaking it in there too. So
yeah. So when I start actually quilting, I think
you're going to be a pro already.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Well, speaking of quilting, if anyone's watching who maybe also wants to get into quilting or is thinking about wanting to start quilting, we actually have a quilting live retreat with Craftsy. This is with Colleen Talkie and Kelly Ashton, and that is on March 30th and 31st. We can probably put a link in the comments on how to join that if you want more information on that. But if you're interested in quilting or do quilting on the side, it's going to be a lot of fun. And it's a 2-day, again, virtual retreat. So it's going to be awesome. All right, our next one here, Janice asks, do you think I need to interface the fabric before adding a button and buttonhole on an 18-inch doll poncho? The pattern did not say. The fabric content is unknown, no info on the bolt end, but it's a nice doll-sized plaid, so I bought it.
Cute. I would say, so for any button and buttonhole that I would be sewing for myself, I would definitely say interface the wrong side of the fabric because it's a stress point on a garment, especially the buttonhole, because you're pushing the button through and you want to make sure the fabric is stabilized and is not going to stretch out of place with the use of it. So I do think the same thing would apply to a doll poncho, because you might not be putting the button through the buttonhole as often as if you were wearing it yourself, but it still sounds like those buttonholes are going to get some use. So I would definitely say for the longevity throughout the life of that garment, to interface behind those buttonholes and behind the buttons as well, because that's also a stress point. The point that you sew that button on, it's going to get pulled at a little bit. Probably not as much as the buttonhole for a doll poncho, but for something that a person is wearing, sometimes, there's strain on the button as it's clipped into the buttonhole as you're wearing it. So it's always just good practice to interface behind those closure points because they take a lot of stress. So I would say yes.
Perfect. All right, we have a couple more follow-up and comments on Christine's project, because by far my favorite thing we've talked about all morning so far. So she says, thank you for all the good ideas, and that the wire technique will probably work best for the project. But then Beverly adds, what about Stiffy Stiff to make it stay curled? She's used that product for Halloween ghosts, and I've never heard of it. Have you heard of that one in particular?
I never have, but yeah, if it makes like cheesecloth or whatever fabric you use for Halloween ghosts stiffen up enough to hold their shape, it could work for craft felt as well. So
Yeah.
yeah, you can
And
look that up.
I have a different and I'm blanking on the name of it, and I will have to try and remember it and say it here before we end. But it's one that actually some friends that do t-shirt quilts a lot, they use it, and you just spray it on there. Tyrial Magic. It's called Tyrial Magic, and you spray it on there, and it makes it almost stiff like paper, because they use it to stiffen it up, and then you can actually run your fabric like right through your printer if you want to print. It makes it that stiff. So Tyrial Magic might be another one too but I don't know if that's a permanent thing. But so many fun ideas on how to make things different. I love it.
Yeah.
All right. Kelly wants to know, what are the advantages or disadvantages of a computerized sewing machine versus a manual one? Which one would be good for a beginner, and which do you prefer?
I'm glad you asked that, Kelly, because this is a discussion that we've had before. And I'm a proponent of the more manual machines, and I know Ashley loves the more computerized machines. So I will make my case first. No, computerized machines are great too, because I know they take a lot of the guesswork out of it. It has, it's a little computer that has all of that information built in. So I know on Ashley, one of Ashley's anyway, if you have a question about anything, you can just hit that little question mark button, and it's like having a computer right at your fingertips, right, all in one place, which is great, and it senses the thickness of the fabric and adjusts tension for you and all these cool automatic things. For me though, I like to know what's going on, so that if I encounter a problem, I know what happened and how to fix it. So I think just with any type of software too, computer parts, um, they make good decisions most of the time, but sometimes you know what you want to do with that fabric, and if it's something that the machine is like, no, wait, you should do this instead, it can kind of override you. So I like to have more control over my functions and my settings. And like I said earlier about my little bobbin plate that popped off, I know how to go in and fix that now. But if something goes wrong with your software in the computer, that's definitely going to have to go to a specialist, because you probably can't get in and fix the software yourself. That's just more specialized. So there are pros and cons. I think it is beneficial for a beginner sewer to start on a more manual machine, because they're cheaper. So it's less of an investment while you're growing your skills and figuring out what direction you want to go with it. If you want to do, get a more quilting machine as you upgrade, you can figure out where you're going first on like a little bit of a lower level machine. And also, I think it's beneficial to start with a manual machine because you can, I think it's important to learn, how the machine works and get a feel for the different tension settings and, how all of those things work together rather than just, pushing a button and having it all done for you. I think it's valuable for a seamstress to build your skills in that way first. And then if you want to upgrade to something that has more capabilities and a little bit more automation, then you can take that next step up.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, you were right. I definitely 100% love my computerized machine because I like, if I'm going to stitch on a medium weight woven fabric, I go into the little touch screen and I select exactly what fabric I'm using, and then it just does everything for me. So I like that. I also like that, like you said, if I have a question or there's a new technique, my machine actually plays video tutorials. So it like essentially makes me obsolete sometimes, but it's like if I didn't know how to applique something, it has step by step a little video that plays that shows. So it's like it is a great teacher as well. But I mean, I've been sewing for over 20 years now, and I started on a machine, a lower end one. We've talked about this before. It was a Brother machine that I bought for like $80. And so, but I never would have started on the machine that I have now. There's just no way. So I 100% agree that as a beginner, get that more hands-on. You have to make the decisions. You have to learn machine. I still have that really inexpensive Brother, and I plan to teach my sons how to sew on that one. They don't get to use the fancy one until they've proven themselves. So yeah,
Good
so we agree on that part.
Great.
All right. Deanna says, I noticed that you can buy clothing patterns in the traditional paper, or they can email it to you. How do you use an emailed pattern?
That is a really good question too, Deanne, because that comes up a lot, and a lot of the like indie pattern companies do it that way because it's cheaper for them to produce instead of producing printed patterns. And I will use e-patterns a lot when it's like a free pattern that you just download. And sometimes they're great and they have instructions on them as to how to print that off and tape it together to make sure you're getting, the right size and everything. Sometimes they don't have that, but you can kind of gauge from the lines on the paper where to tape it together. But a lot of times they will have on one of the first pages, they'll have a little test square. So it'll say 1 inch or a 2-inch test square, and you print that out and measure it and make sure you're using the right scale on your printing software. But a lot of times the pattern will instruct you to select auto scale or 100% scaling or whatever if you're using Adobe or some other software, they may call it a different thing, but it's just making sure that it is at the correct scale when it's printed out and it's not like fitting it to the page or anything. And that's where that test square comes in. When you print it out, measure it to make sure you're at the right scale, and then you can print the rest of them out. And a lot of times on those e-patterns, they will have a little crosshatch in the corner for you to align the next pages. So you would just match up those lines with the corresponding pages and tape them together. For me, a lot of times I will just, I'll be able to see through the paper, so I will just like lay it on top. But some people like to just cut off that edge. So align the crosshatch down the page and either draw a line and then just cut that extra away, like cutting a seam allowance away kind of, so that you can then align that cut edge right with the next, the crosshatch of the next piece of paper. And then I use a lot of tape when I tape my patterns together because it's just annoying to me when the middle of the pattern is like flapping apart.
Yeah.
So make sure you have a lot of Scotch tape in your house. But yeah, once you get everything taped together, then just treat it like a regular pattern, cut out the right size and everything. But I would say it's definitely trace off, instead of cutting out the size out of the pattern papers that you just meticulously tape together. Trace off the size, because it would be devastating to cut out that pattern and then realize it's the wrong size, or you needed to make alterations or something, and then have to print it off and tape it together all over again. So that's a good practice for even if you're using like a commercial like tissue paper pattern. Trace off your size first and use that to cut out and preserve the original.
Yeah, otherwise you'd have a lot of tape to then tape it back together to then cut it out to the right size. Yeah. All right. Kate adds to our horsehair canvas conversation that you could potentially use it in making shopping bags.
Yeah, that's a good idea to interline in between layers of shopping bags, just to add a little bit more sturdiness to it and strength, for sure.
Yep, absolutely. All right, Mark asks, is it true that you don't need to pre-wash knits before sewing as they don't shrink during the first wash and drying?
So knits can be made from just a wide array of different fiber contents. And the fiber content is what is going to determine, and how that fiber was treated before it was sold. That's going to determine whether it shrinks or not. So cotton is a great one for shrinking. But it's just a good practice. I will always say pre-wash your fabric, because it takes the what if out of it. Just pre-wash it. It's going to not only pre-shrink it for you, if that's going to happen, it's going to get rid of any excess dye that didn't come out after the manufacturing process. Sometimes manufacturers will put like a protective coating on the fabric to protect it from UV and humidity and all that kind of stuff as it's sitting on the bolt before it gets sold, and that's called sizing, confusingly. So washing will get rid of that sizing, just get rid of the, that protective chemical coating that some manufacturers may put on it, which sometimes makes the fabric feel a little bit stiffer. So it can change the hand or the drape of the fabric a little bit once it's washed. And I want to know how that fabric is going to behave, how it feels before I cut my pattern pieces out of it. So I think that it is just a good idea to wash and dry the fabric the way that you're going to wash and dry the finished product, to make sure you know how it's going to react to it, and get rid of any, pre-shrinking or, like I said, sizing or whatever beforehand.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny because I get to do Q&A sessions with you for sewing, but I also get to do some for quilting sometimes too. And this conversation, it's something that's debated pre-wash versus not pre-wash. Doesn't matter if you sew quilts, it's always, and it's so funny because the answers are so different. Because in quilting, I never pre-wash my fabric unless it's a color that I think is going to bleed, because I want to just get right into it. But definitely, yeah, if it's something that because I'm not worried about how a quilt is going to fit me, but I would definitely want to pre-wash it if you are worried about the size. So I just think it's fun that, the answer can vary depending on project. So we're about out of time, but I do want to follow up with one that I actually had this question come in to customer service earlier this morning, and it was about pre-washing and pre-shrinking fusible interfacing, which is something that I never do. We have a video on National Sewing Circle. Beth Bradley taught it. She does pre-shrink her fusible interfacing by just soaking it in water and letting it air dry. So is that something you would ever do? Have you ever done it? Would you recommend, if you're going to be pre-washing, pre-shrinking everything else, do you need to?
That is a really good question, because I never have. And I don't think that I ever would. I can see that some maybe small amount of shrinkage might occur, but I've never had any problems with my garments that have fusible interfacing in them. I've never seen that fusible shrink up enough to be visible to me. So for the small amount of shrinkage that might occur, it's not worth it to me to pre-wash that fusible. So yeah, I probably won't take that extra step, but I can see And fusible is, it's like a pressed material, so it's not like a regular woven or knit material that it acts differently. So yeah, I won't be doing that, but you raise a good point. That's a good question. Some people have different processes, and I can see the case for doing it, but yeah, I don't think
Yeah.
so.
I think it's awesome that there are so many different ways to say make the same shirt. It doesn't matter how you approach it. It might look the same in the end, but you probably made it completely different way than somebody else. So
Yeah.
awesome. I love it. Well, I want to thank you so much for being here to answer everyone's sewing questions and give so many fun tips and advice. And I still think that we all need to see pictures of this leprechaun beard, but I love that we talked about that. Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for being here.
Thank you.